Hey, welcome everyone to another live broadcast. Today we are joined by Rebecca Carson, who is the author of the book Immanent Externalities, The Reproduction of Life in Capital. It was published in the Historical Materialism book series last year. And we will first hear from Rebecca about the book, and her presentation will then be followed by a discussion with Dave Beach. Rebecca is a lecturer in critical and historical studies at the Royal College of Art, London, and Dave Beach is a reader in art and Marxism at the University of Arts, London. He's also the author of several books, including Art and Value, Art and Labor, and forthcoming Between Exploitation and Stigma. So we're going to have the presentation, which will be about 30 minutes. Then we'll have the discussion, but we will also have time for a Q&A. So please do put any questions that you have in the YouTube chat. And Rebecca and Dave will be able to get to them after the presentation and discussion. Okay, that's all for me. And I will hand over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. I want to give a big thank you to Alex for organizing this and to Dave for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to have Dave responding to this. So I'm just going to jump into the presentation. I wanted to start with just really describing what's in the book. So I'm going to start with introducing the main argument that the book makes, which will be based on three interconnected claims that I'll go through. And that will be sort of the first section. Then I'm going to briefly discuss each chapter to give a sense of the book's content. And lastly, I'll describe the book's conclusion and open up a discussion around the theoretical terrain the book tries to open up. So I'm going to start with part one of the presentation, which is an introduction to the main themes. So my book arose from a desire to theorize three developments besetting both the reproduction of human life and the development of capitalism in the 21st century. So these include rapid ecological transformation, crisis in social care, and the world historic expansion of finance. My book attempts to theorize their interconnection by reconstructing Marx's critique from the perspective of reproduction. And in doing so, I developed the concept of immanent externalities. This concept, I argue, enables theory to grasp the non-capitalist life processes that are produced by and necessary for capitalist reproduction. So the book is a critique of value theoretical readings of capitalism that focus on the impersonal domination of capital's abstractions without sufficient attention to the forms of subjection at play within capital's total reproduction, where interpersonal forms of domination operate, albeit in a manner internal to capitalism as a society. And so crucially, that means reading all three volumes of Capital together. Non-capitalist interpersonal forms of domination, racialized, gendered, ableist, colonial, imperial, ideological, and legal, are parts of a unified process of circulation and reproduction in capitalism and are central to capitalist exploitation. They're conditions of possibility for capital's social form. At the same time, the book is a critique of social reproduction readings of capital that don't fully account for the systematic way interpersonal forms of domination are determined by the historical development of capital's logic, where the person, in quotations, is a legal category distinct from its bearers. So it's another level of abstraction, rendering possible particular subjects, reciprocities and dependencies, and forms of domination that are not purely capitalist, but also aren't pre-capitalist. Such personal relations do not have a concrete reality separate from capital's real abstractions and their impersonal domination. But neither are they products of a value formalism. They are realized by various determinations in their empirical concreteness. And hence, the book argues that non-capitalist forms of domination and capitalist dominations are intrinsically linked within a social formation, which is a capitalist mode of production or the capitalist society as a whole. And so these are all dialectical categories. The argument of the book is constructed through three interrelated arguments, which the 5 chapters substantiate through different perspectives. So the first argument is that the capitalist mode of production as a historical formation depends on a combination of modes of subjection to reproduce. This includes both impersonal relations of capital's fetish character and non-capitalist interpersonal relations where there are racial and gendered hierarchies used to ensure the reproduction of labor takes place. Interpersonal forms of domination redistribute value away from individuals through structurally mediating life-making activity within capital's reproduction. While shorn of the dynamism of capitalist production, these are nevertheless dominative and immiserating relations unfolding within the circulation process. I argue that the articulation of the proportion of these forms of domination evolves historically in a way that is nonlinear, with the financialization of capital reflecting a counterintuitive return to the centrality of interpersonal forms of domination. And this is due to the financial appropriation of larger shares of surplus value. The second argument is that the basis of the capitalist reproduction process is constituted by the multiple temporalities of monetary circulation, which involves the circulation of credit money and therefore future constraints on subjects. When capitalist reproduction is understood in this way, it becomes apparent that the site of the central contradiction of capitalism is displaced from the Marxian emphasis on the production-wage-labor relation. Although production-wage-labor relations condition the character of capitalism, to assume production as the sole or even primary site of capitalist contradiction is a reductive reading of the logic of capital's total social process, which a reading of all 3 volumes of Capital will show you. The root of contradiction within capitalist social relations ought to be located in the tension between capitalist and non-capitalist elements of capital circulation. In this book, the non-capitalist elements are termed immanent externalities, as they are logically required for formal circulation to take place and provide the basis for capital's reproduction process, which are both produced or shaped by capital and remain other to capital. And so immanent externalities is a logical category. Often people ask, like, what are the immanent externalities? And there are lots of different things because it's a logical category. And so looking at the empirical particularity will get you different things. And maybe the same act could be in one instance an immanent externality, or it could be value producing, depending on its situation within social relation. So thirdly, attention to the contradiction. This is a third argument the book makes. Attention to the contradiction between capitalist and non-capitalist forms and processes internal to the reproduction process of capital reveals an under-examined contradiction underpinning Capital's 3 volumes. There are 2 conflictual concepts of life operating in capital's reproduction, one capitalist and the other non-capitalist. This tension between capital's abstract life process, or the movement of value forms, on the one hand, which is only ever life-like, and human life and nature on the other, begets a contradiction between the possibilities for their respective reproductions, highlighting capital's inherent tendency to undermine the biological existence of human life and nature on which it depends. In combination, these 3 arguments produce a broader understanding of the structural interconnection between 3 prevailing forms of exploitation and social domination: the daily and generational renewal of human life, ecological degradation, and finance capital. The book constructs a framework from which to understand their co-production. To do this, it reconstructs Marx's project from the perspective of all 3 volumes of Capital, addressed not from the point of view of the hidden abode of production, but from what forms the conditions of possibility of production, reproduction. Now I'm going to move to part 2 of the presentation, where I'm going to go through each chapter, just sort of briefly explaining the contents of the book. So the book begins with the chapter Fictitious Capital and the Reemergence of Personal Forms of Domination. This chapter proposes that the renewed centrality of interpersonal forms of domination should be grasped within the context of the impersonal domination that structures the fetish character of capitalist social relations. It argues that the increased circulation of fictitious capital, a result of financialization, the rise of asset management, and increased rentierism, undermines this reemergence of personal forms of domination. When dominated by the circulation of fictitious capital, inhabitants of capitalist society become subject to interpersonal domination and dependencies existing within the sphere of the reproduction and circulation of capital. These dependencies are constituted by social relations that, while produced by capitalist relations, are not strictly capitalist, such as gender, racial, debtor-creditor, and other legal contracts or kinship relations. Consequently, the chapter elaborates social practices that facilitate the reproduction of human life, bear greater stress when capital incurs barriers to valorization engendered by interruptions in production. Chapter 1 contends that fictitious capital is substantiated by future labor rather than past labor. This temporal discordance places increased pressure on social reproduction. And this is because the social reproduction of labor is what ensures the reproduction of future labor power. And so austerity, for example, in its purported need to save money to account for future labor already spent, relies on increasing free reproductive labor required by members of society. The variable of social reproduction, therefore, lies at the heart of fictitious capital circulation, being required to reproduce both labor in the present and labor in the future. The dual demand imposed by fictitious capital hence subjects social reproduction to greater strain. So now that's sort of description of chapter 1. Now I'm going to move to chapter 2, which is around the money form. This chapter unfolds in a methodological register that's distinct from the other chapters. It provides an intellectual history of the concept of money as money, which is the medium of capital's reproduction. The chapter examines the monetary understanding of capital developed in the confrontation between members of the editorial collective of the Italian workers' journal Primo Maggio and French Marxist Suzanne de Bernhoft, examining competing ideas and paths not taken, reflecting historical changes in the circulation of the money form. The chapter mobilizes a theory of money as an immanent externality, a necessary logical position as the medium of circulation and therefore reproduction of capital's abstract form. And so that's why I was saying earlier that immanent externality is a logical category, because it's something that's internal to the logic of capital, that in order to reproduce capital, it requires a form that is other to capital. And so the logical method of the book is established through reflection on the immanent and external nature of money in its facilitation of capital's abstract movement as a medium of reproduction. Such reflection shows that value logically, capital requires what is ontologically other to it as a medium of its reproduction. And the term immanent externality was it was taken from Suzanne de Bernhoft. She never used the term immanent externality precisely, but she referred to money as both immanent and external. And so the concept was kind of developed from a reading of her theory of money. Now I'm going to move to chapter 3, the fetish character. And this chapter establishes an interpretation of the fetish character of capital's social form that provides a theoretical account of the integration of the category of the person on which the book's full argument relies. And so this is a reading of capital's fetish character that includes the co-fetish of the legal person. And so it brings with it a Marxist theory of law into debates and theories of commodity fetishism from a value formal perspective. This interpretation is used to grasp the nature of subjection, where the fetish character articulates the specificity of the impersonal abstract social relations unique to capital's social form. This is undertaken to understand different modes of subjection to capitalist social relations from the standpoint of reproduction, the social process of which production is a part. The concept of the person is systematically applied here as a legal category, despite Marx's own inconsistency on this point. This is done to better understand the forms of subjection within social reproduction, where the human individual is subject to capital's abstract forms, both directly and indirectly through inclusion in and exclusion from impersonal and interpersonal forms of domination. The argument is made that the reification of persons as character masks of the personification of things, the impersonal relation, requires the additional mediation of the juridical mask of the person. The social relations determined by capital's abstractions require the juridical category of the person to confirm the legal contract underpinning property and wage labor. Here we can see the function of law as a kind of metaphysics of capital required to objectify value forms. And so personalization and depersonalization, or the personal and impersonal, are two sides of the same process. Hence, exchange entails a double subjective effect, where the bearer is both subject to impersonal relations and rendered a juridical subject, a person endowed with an abstract individual freedom. They are both subject to and a subject of capital's social relations. The former determines the limits of the element of freedom internal to the latter. A juridical person must freely choose to exchange, but can only do so as a bearer of a juridical mask within commodified social relations, and limits to this are defined by social class or property relations, what you own, if you own nothing but your labor, or what kinds of commodity one is buying or selling. Meanwhile, exclusion from the category of the person along racial, ableist, and gendered lines permits capital to accumulate more profit by establishing free and cheap resources and labor. The mediation of the person and exclusion therefrom is therefore essential for non-capitalist forms of domination within capitalism. This chapter ultimately argues that personhood and the practice of exclusion from constitutes a significant site of struggle in the reproduction of capital's social relations, exacerbated by crisis in the reproduction of production and the expanding circulation of fictitious capital or financial forms. So now I'm going to move to chapter 4, that's titled Time and Schemas of Reproduction. This chapter examines the place of circulation in Capital Volume 2 to discuss how the formal mode of capital circulation, which takes place in expanded reproduction, relies on interruptions to capital's valorization in order to self-reproduce. Such interruptions are non-capitalist forms that act as a medium of reproduction, taking various forms from money hoards. So money has to be hoarded in a way, so it's taken away from circulation. So it has a sort of like temporal discordance from the circulation of value directly moving towards profit accumulation. So there's that, but also human life processes interrupt that circulation and movement, such as sleep. Biology, physiology, and further effective qualities comprise life-making processes that, as concrete reproduction, are natural limits to capital's reproduction. Pregnancy and infant care require decreased exertion of labor power, while sleep is necessary and elders become less able to work, etc. These processes have historically specific qualities of different needs under different relations, yet they also retain a trans-historical dimension or an irreducibly extra-capitalistic potential to reproduce themselves in changed conditions. Here we find that the reproduction of capitalist social relations engages what is other to capital through the distribution of extraction, excretion, production, and consumption in circulation. In doing so, capital's abstractions connect practices that are concretely or temporally and historically disconnected. This chapter shows how the tension between concrete life and capital's abstract form work together in practice within the realm of circulation, in which there is a complex synchronicity and non-synchronicity of temporality. The reproduction schemas in volume 2 reflect how the concrete imposes natural limits to the movement of capital as abstract forms. And so it's a kind of reckoning with that you can theorize the circulation of capital's abstract movement, but you're never going to quite understand how value is circulating without seeing how it's like moving between the kind of stuff of life that changes and disrupts, problematizes how it is that value is moving throughout its forms. This chapter examines the reproduction of elements that interrupt the reproduction of capital, and in doing so, exposes two concepts of reproduction, two concepts of life at work, one of capital's abstract form, engendered in the reproductions of relations of production, and the other of concrete life, both of human and nature. This chapter claims that these respective concepts can only be understood with attention to the temporal concepts deployed by Marx in his presentation of circulation in volume 2. And volume 2 really is a book, kind of a book about temporality, because you're thinking about motion, movement, the time it takes for capital circuits, for value to circulate and capital to accumulate profit. The articulation of these two modes of reproduction is then deployed in the last chapter to subsequently make the claim that Marx, to subsequently sort of develop this claim that Marx has two concepts of life. And so now I'm going to move to briefly introduce the final chapter of the book, chapter 5, titled Marx's Social Theory of Reproduction. The book's argument culminates in chapter 5, Marx's social theory of reproduction, which clarifies the Hegelian grounding of Marx's idea of the life process of capital. And this is analyzed to demonstrate that Hegel's concept of reproduction provides a better understanding of the inner tension between capitalist interiority and exteriority in Marx. The retrieval of Hegel's category of life, which internalizes his concept of reproduction, develops the claim that Marx uses two distinct concepts of life in the critique of political economy. One is used to explain the abstract life process of capital, and the other the concrete life of humans in metabolic relation with nature. To develop this thesis, the chapter examines Marx's inheritances, on the one hand, the philosophy of life in German idealism, and concepts of life derived from the natural sciences, which is burgeoning at the time of Capital's writing. This chapter reworks these legacies to deploy an interpretation of Marx that reconstructs the tension between capitalist and non-capitalist forms, where capital's abstract forms require non-capitalist forms as means of reproduction. Capital as an abstraction is the free subject with its independent right. To exemplify something that Marx takes from Hegel. However, in Capital, the Hegelian reconciliation of being and essence in the concept occurs only in the movement of abstractions, and there is no reconciliation between matter and capital's forms. So what's that saying is that the dialectics that you see in Hegel's logic occurs in the context of an analysis of the value form and the movement of capital's abstractions, and the concrete life exists dialectically in relation to that with a different kind of logic. Developed from the Hegelian dialectics of the idea, life, completely fetishized to elucidate capital, is only ever lifelike. And in Marx, he exemplifies this through showing how this lifelike character is abstract labor, which is dead labor. And that's why he uses these metaphors of vampire, that it's sort of like the life of the dead. Therefore, matter and capital cannot be ontologically understood from the point of view of Hegel's philosophy. So the claim is that we can use Hegel to understand the ontology of capital, but not the being of human life in nature. Yet those two are dialectically positioned to co-produce one another. And so Hegel's philosophy does tell us something about matter, but in this kind of dialectical relationship that's asymmetrical. In capital, the ontological prerequisite of concrete life remains conflictual and produces permanent interruptions and obstacles to the concept subject capital, which has acquired an autonomous life. This bifurcation occurs because the life process of capital is entirely fetishized and abstract, while the life of those living within capitalist social relations remains concrete. In the dialectically reunified category of living labor, which contains both the abstract and the concrete, concrete natural life and the life of capital exist in permanent tension without reconciliation. Therein, the two concepts of life form an antagonism whereby concrete life is completely internal to the realm of reproduction or the reproduction of human life in metabolic relation to nature. And hence, for Marx, Hegel's logic remains at the level of an ontology of capital or a logic of abstractions and does not provide the basis for ontological understandings of human anthropology or matter and the natural world. Due to natural limits, the metabolic process between humans and nature will always remain antagonistic to capital's social forms. But the concrete will also be historically altered, and therefore close attention to Marx's form analysis ought not to be used merely to grant ontological primacy to capital's abstractions, but should be analyzed as a materialist orientation for understanding what the precise limits of capital's abstractions are and how they relate to the complexities of materials that constitute the world. What is other to capital is logically and concretely understood to remain an element which reproduces itself for its own sake. This represents an ontological distinction with the logical process of reproduction that permits us to analyze the extent to which the concrete remains independent. Consequently, it is then possible to articulate how this independence could be retained and developed for purposes other than the reproduction of capital. In other words, by differentiating capitalist and non-capitalist relations while theorizing their logical interrelation, that is, the immanence of the non-capitalist within capitalism, theory can better identify domination and emancipatory possibilities by more precisely determining points at which non-capitalist practices bolster or contradict capital's logic at large. So that's kind of a description of chapter 5. Now I'm going to move to the final part of the presentation, the conclusion, where I want to discuss what is meant, the terrain that's opened up by the book. Here the argument is that an apora is opened by Marx's two categories of life: political economy and the positive sciences. There is an overriding formalism internal to Hegel's idealism that is in tension with Marx's use of physiology to account for concrete life and its reproduction. The lack of reconciliation between capital's abstract self-movement and concrete metabolic processes resists the subsumption of concept and matter necessary for Hegel's project. Marx's account of concrete life, for its part, is both eclectic, relying on a combination of a critique of Feuerbachian humanism and the study of natural sciences, and incompletely theorized. This generates a methodological aporia concerning the two sides. How are we to think both the life of capital and that of human life and nature? Marx's materialism of practice, far from neatly resolving epistemological difficulties, opens up much thornier problems related to political economy's mediation with the positive sciences, which were shown to be methodologically necessary in their ontological otherness. And of course, there's going to be major differences in how the positive sciences are understood in the present conjuncture than when Marx was writing Capital. Drawing on Hegel's logic, the critique of political economy formulates the ontology of capital, but on Marx's reckoning, it cannot methodologically think the empirical positive sciences. Meanwhile, the positive sciences are necessary to give relevance to the critique of political economy. Alone, the positive sciences cannot convincingly think the ontology of capital, yet capital impinges on their subject matter. And here, the status of non-capitalist elements acquires philosophical difficulty. How precisely do they uphold the challenge or challenge the reproduction of capital's social form? This reconstruction aims to open up the possibility of resolving these issues by delineating the logical place of elements that exceed the epistemological framework of the critique of political economy. This, in turn, establishes a framework to begin synthesizing logical concepts with empirical detail. In this regard, one might begin to address the practicalities of different modes of subjection or socialization and practices of reproduction. These are all immanent externalities, and they accord to the particular logical tension as non-capitalist elements underpinning capital's reproduction process. Locating the incompatibility of political economy's logic with the positive sciences enables analysis to see that concrete life will always retain an element that reproduces itself for its own sake, or at least not for capitals, and in doing so will engender natural limits that in turn impose limits on capital's abstract forms. This permits analysis to question the extent to which concrete life is modified by capitalist abstract forms and the extent to which concrete life retains its independence, or how its independence is modified. So it will be a different kind of independence without that mediation. A study from the standpoint of this logical exposition of reproduction, enriched with a more robust orientation to the positive sciences or metabolic anthropology, can thus bring theory and praxis closer to reckoning with the ways concrete life can overcome its role in merely creating the conditions necessary for the reproduction of capital's abstract forms. The concept of immanent externalities enables us to see how struggles within the realm of social reproduction and ecological stewardship contain anti-capitalist content, albeit anti-capitalist content has yet to take anti-capitalist form. The role of socialist struggle is to convert this anti-capitalist content within struggles for reproduction of human life and nature into the necessary larger scale confrontation with capital's total process. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So the miracle is that all of that is contained in 187 pages in the book. So so you're covering Marx's 3 volumes, which is around about 2,800 pages, and condense them into this very readable form. It is, I think it's because of the kind of work that I've been doing over however many years, it's a very important book because it contributes to a kind of an important rereading, and as you pointed out, you know, the methodologically the really significant thing is to read the 3 volumes together, and in a sense that the way I see it is to read the first volume again through the second and third volume, and this is why I think we end up with these kinds of new formulations of, you know, the relationship between value and life, and bringing kind of organic life and nature and reproduction into our understanding of capitalism. So I want to. Part of this is my own ignorance, I think, but it's also maybe other people are ignorant as well. So it's worth asking. So what I want to do is to kind of ask you a few questions about some details, which are obscure to me. And, you know, one of the things is after reading your book, Rebecca, I then read Susan de Brunoff, who I'd not read before, and I kind of hoped that she would clear things up for me, and in order to read your book, and so I kind of, and I recommend reading the 2 together, because they do have a kind of dialogue. But I'm still left slightly unsure of the relationship between the capitalist and the non-capitalist, and where that is being drawn for you. So mainstream economists, as you know, especially neoliberals, claim that everything is economic because it has a cost. But non-capitalist elements in your writing are not the same as non-economic activities in theirs. Or what might be non-economic, but is ruled out as being non-economic. Do you put non-capitalist practices under the heading of social reproduction? So is social reproduction the guide to understanding what is non-capitalist? Or is the category of the non-capitalist more capacious than social reproduction? How do you define what is non-capitalist? And is this a perfect synonym of immanent externalities, or do they actually go in different directions for you?
Thank you, Dave, for that question, because I think it's a really important question, because it's the kind of logical crux of the book, and kind of like one's foot into what the book is doing, but it's also really complicated, and that's why it kind of takes the whole book to sort of work out what the role is of these capitalists versus non-capitalists. The I think to answer the question, I think it's more useful to start from what the definition of capitalist relations is in order to get to what the definition of non-capitalist relations is. And what this reading of the 3 volumes of Marx together opens up is how the capitalist relation, depending on the historical conjuncture, could be quite a small sliver of the social whole. And so there'll be historical moments where the production of value is the production of abstract value takes up quite a lot of makes up quite a lot of the money that's in circulation, and historical moments where a lot of the money in circulation is fictitious capital, what I refer to as unvalorized value, which is speculative future value, and it's not value that's valorized. And so what capitalist relations means is value producing relations, which is a very small part of capitalist society as a whole. So value is abstract labor, and the only relation that can produce abstract labor is the capital labor relation, wage labor. And so only the capitalist labor relation can produce more valorized value. But that's not to say that quite a lot of wealth within the capitalist society is fictitious value, that is sort of speculative value, thinking about future productive relations. And so capitalist relations don't refer to all relations within capitalist society, but to the specific relations that make the capitalist mode of production a capitalist mode of production. And that's the capital labor relation, which accounts for quite a small sliver. And I have a quote here that I wanted to share from Beverly Best's book, The Automatic Fetish, because I think that's another book that came out recently that's like really good on how we're thinking the connection between production and reproduction, circulation, financialization, because this is a book that's a reading of volume 3. And her book is like very committed also to this value theoretical perspective that the definition of capitalism is this capital labor relation, despite the fact that quite a lot of the wealth is fictitious and financialized. And she says, if we could graph the irreducible variety of forms of life making on a pie chart, only a very thin wedge of that chart would constitute the activity that capital is able to turn into productive labor, that is, that capital is able to harness for the production of value. And so that is sort of like what is essential to what makes capitalist social relations, but it doesn't mean that other forms of wealth don't feed off of that and then create other kinds of domination that become quite pernicious and exemplary of our current conjuncture in the 21st century, where financialization and rentierism as well, because rents doesn't produce a landlord extracting rents doesn't produce more value. It's a way of redistributing value so that we get a kind of polarization of wealth in a particular way. But linked to that, I wanted to say a little bit about of how I'm understanding social reproduction, because the question included like, you asked, is social reproduction non-capitalist? And the answer is yes. But it's kind of confusing at the moment because Marx's definition of social reproduction refers to the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, whereas within like contemporary Marxist feminism, social reproduction theory, social reproduction is redefined to articulate the reproduction of labor power. And so that's to understand, and also put another way, the reproduction or the practice of life making, so the reproduction of human life. Within capitalism. But I'm working with a concept of social reproduction that is more linked to Marx. And these are non-capitalist due to that kind of logical relation it has to the reproduction of capital's social form necessarily requires it's other. And so what facilitates the conditions of possibility is the realm of social reproduction. And that's sort of in a kind of commitment to Marx's articulation of it. And so, yeah, it just differentiates from that more narrow definition used within social reproduction theory. Generally, not all theorists are using it that way. Does that answer the question?
I want to press you on this a little bit because it relates to other discourses that people will maybe be familiar with. So, how does this concept of non-capitalist relate, for instance, to the idea of decommodification? And maybe like a Keynesian idea, like Tibor Skitovsky in the 70s said that the consumption of goods and services may or may not be economic satisfactions, depending on whether or not they go through the market and acquire a market value in the process. So that the passage through the market determines whether something is economic or not, but doesn't determine whether it's capitalist or not. Do you think of the non-capitalist not in terms of this idea of the market, but in terms of maybe Marx's formula of CMC exchanges and MCM transactions, which go through the market? So CMCs go through the market, but they're not capitalist transactions.
Yeah, you're still relating to that, like you're still mediated by the value form, but it's not value producing.
Yeah.
And your question is like, can it be? I think like because of the realm of reproduction is so internally differentiated, there will be what is the reason why it's a realm that I'm interested that is like important for politicizing, I think, is because it has that element of like also the same act can be commodified, but also it retains this possibility of not being commodified. Because you asked if these diverged, and the hope is that non-capitalist ceases to be imminent within the capitalist relation, because it's transhistorical. It doesn't, like, these things exist before capitalism and they can exist after capitalism. And so the fact that it always formally retains its potential to be not commodified is why it's something that we can harness towards a sort of broader socialist politics that looks at undermining the reproduction of capital. But I think that, yeah, these relations definitely are decommodified in all sorts of ways all the time, in that, like, through interpersonal interactions, there are ways in which communities enable the reproduction of the sort of life-making practices to happen without money exchange, sort of like kinship relations. All the time have these sorts of decommodified interactions, but nonetheless, are kind of reclaimed and positioned in relation to the commodification, and are, I think, kind of need a broader politicization in order to actually use that as anti-capitalist, which is why at the end of the presentation I said there's a difference between anti-capitalist content and anti-capitalist form. So I think we see a lot of anti-capitalist content, but not in form.
Yeah, that was a great point you made in the presentation. My ears pricked up when you said that. You draw on feminist social reproduction theory to open up the analysis of capitalism beyond the wage system. And I was wondering how this relates to other thinkers. Jairus Banaji has made a similar argument about the abstract scholastic formalism of the Marxist analysis of the capitalist mode of production, which has reduced capitalism to a narrow ideal type of direct exploitation and which has neglected the diverse forms of capitalism. Do you want to extend the Marxist theories of capitalism in both directions, both within the non-productive sphere, that non-productive as non-production of value, the non-productive sphere that is located within the advanced economies and outside, to those models of the capitalist mode of production in diverse global forms of value extraction and non-standard forms of exploitation? Is that what this is opening up to? That kind of expansion in both directions?
Yes, yeah, thank you for that question. I was really excited that you asked that question because I'll talk about it in a bit in a minute, but I'm currently working on a new project that is using the Banerjee to expand these things. But the aim of the book really is to open up directions beyond the first 4 chapters of Capital Volume 1, essentially. The connection between Banerjee's point about modes of exploitation and SRT is a really important one that I want to make because of the complexity of unproductive labor and also the sort of way in which wage labor, Banerjee's critique of wage labor is really articulate on that point around how that I made before, how there's like quite a small sliver of what is like quote unquote value producing labor. And Banerjee says that Banerjee's work says that there are like multiple modes of exploitation that then are directed for the wage form, directed towards the reproduction of the wage form. The wage form is like relational to these things. And so we're not thinking about like, it's a kind of assimilation of all, an assimilative sort of theory to say that all sorts of labor take that kind of form. But the project that I'm working on aims to open up discussions around the discrete modes of exploitation that Banerjee uses to offer a kind of corrective intervention into the way the term expropriation is used within Marxist feminism and ecology, Marxist ecology, that articulates the unpaid, stolen, or taken, because I think expropriation, the definition of it implies that the thing that you're taking is already property. And so this entails a kind of colonial application of the status or ontology of that matter, that it is you're conceiving it as property. And much of what is taken isn't property before it has been taken. And so you get this kind of like accumulation by dispossession, the more sort of David Harvey approach. And so Banerjee makes this point about labor in its multiplicity of forms that echoes this structural element that best does it. The wage form is a small sliver of this whole picture. And so that capital is historically in practice characterized by flexibility in how production is structured, how labor is organized, and what form labor takes when it's used for the production of surplus value, is that point that Banerjee makes. And so when Marxism fails to see this, when it is stuck in those 4 chapters of Volume 1, it reproduces a kind of liberal conception of capitalism that understands the individual wage earner as free to sell their labor as the sole basis of accumulation. And so this erases a contribution of both enslaved and collective family units of labor power. Is that sort of the point that Banerjee's making in the theory of history? So capitalism has to be instead understood as a system comprised of a multiplicity of forms of exploitation. So these sort of diverse modes of exploitation is something that was really at the heart of what I was trying to articulate, and that link between Banerjee and social reproduction, I think also is important in terms of using social reproduction. If you're using it for feminist purposes, it's a way of using your understanding of social reproduction in a way that doesn't essentialize gender, because we're not, you're not understanding labor as necessarily unpaid domestic labor in the context of a particular kinship relation. And so that opening up in both directions that you pointed to, I think also enables us to have a kind of de-essentializing Marxist feminism as well.
And as well as going in both directions, there's a sense in which I think when you do address the non-capitalist within capitalism, the way that you're doing it is you're not then in a sense converting the non-capitalist into the capitalist. It retains its negative relationship to capitalism even while it's within the scope and is within the overall kind of totality in which capitalism reproduces itself. But that doesn't make it, that doesn't just like magically turn it into another example of capitalism.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word negative too, because I didn't use that word, but I think that's like central to why this becomes its negativity is why has these sort of political possibilities. It has that anti-capitalist push, even when it might be at the same time directed towards reproducing capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Banerjee's book on that is really thorough. So I would point anyone who's interested in that to his book. It's the Theory is History. It's that collection of essays.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah. So there was another point that you made in your presentation about the relationship between impersonal relations of power and interpersonal relations of power, and or forms of domination, I think is the phrase that you use. And I was thinking about how your argument for these interpersonal forms of domination relate, for instance, to Deleuze when he speaks about debt, and Maurizio Lazzarato's The Making of Indebted Man, where the relation of the debtor is one that where your character is in question, so it becomes a kind of personal relationship to the economy and so forth. And also whether that once we acknowledge those interpersonal relations of power within capitalism, then do we start to notice the interpersonal relations of power that operate even within the productive sphere, for instance, in job interviews, HR regimes, and so on and so forth. So that, getting the sack for posting something on social media, that then the personal has, whereas we think of capitalism as being as running on impersonal forms of domination, like mute compulsion, as Sora Mao puts it. In fact, it's always contained these interpersonal forms of domination as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I wrote that Lazzarato book, The Making of the Indebted Man, it came out maybe a few years before I started writing the book, which was originally my PhD thesis, and it was a big part of my thinking and like why I was prompted to think about these things. So I was reading that and I was slightly unsatisfied with it, and but nonetheless saw the merits, maybe is the wrong word, but what was in it that was really important and really spoke to the present context. And so the work, in a way, aims to rebuild the case, but in in a new way to build on these insights in relation to historical changes that Marx couldn't have seen. So using Marx's value theory to rebuild it, but obviously you couldn't have gotten that from Marx because these are historical changes that Marx wouldn't have seen at the time of writing Capital. And so the difference would be a stronger emphasis on value determination. And that's connected to quite a different concept of the person. And I know that in the Lazzarato, which is building on Deleuze, in The Making of the Indebted Man, the person is derived from a completely different kind of conceptual network than what the concept of the person that I would derive and read it through, which comes from Marxist legal readings. So like Pachacanis, where his understanding of commodity fetishism is complemented by the fetishism of the legal person. And so that legal person is not a naturalistic understanding of the person. And so the human individual is subject to the abstraction of the legal person, which creates the necessary ground for the abstraction of the one's relation to the fetish, the commodity fetish. And so it's a concept of the person that sees the legal fetish as complementary to the commodity fetishism. And so the conceptual a priori, or like framing of how we're understanding the indebted person, is quite different. And so you'll have quite a different kind of I guess political outcome of how you might of that reading. And so I think the task of the book really is to think those things together, of that how that interpersonal relation that Lazzarato and Deleuze refer to in indebtment is understood in relation to the value form. And yeah, I think that would be my answer to the question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I just had a second thought about how credit scores might make those interpersonal forms of domination kind of more impersonal.
Mhm.
They're, and do you think it's the balance between the two, or is the forms that they take is dynamic and is constantly changing, and it's difficult for us to kind of identify,
Yeah.
for instance, that just to say once and for all, finance is about interpersonal relations, whereas production is not. And it feels like those kinds of big statements about sectors is just not going to work very well. Does it feel like that to you?
Yeah, I think it exacerbates one another. That the kind of increased pressure that you feel, like credit scores is a good example, because you make like choices every day around people do all the time around their credit scores, like just making sure they're making payments or whatnot, but it determines their consumption, which determines the kind of like the material of their day-to-day things, of like what commodities are you buying, is also just like what the way you experience your life day to day. And that it's quite pernicious, because that I think that becoming like closer to the person and like a lot more stress on the person, like I think the term human capital is quite good to articulate that kind of intensity of the way in which we're making these sort of banal daily choices. Makes a like value form abstraction also heavier. I think it's related like that. It does become heavier because that is like, yeah, that's mediating that, because that also with indebtment, it's sort of like that future value production. I think that that's sort of like like something that one might experience on a personal level, that is depicting the same kind of logical relation of financial bubbles, where it's like there's loads of investment in something, but if there's no, that is speculative on future profit, but if something doesn't bring back future profit, you start to get this pressure, and it does collapse. And so that is sort of individualized at the level that's individualized us individualized on us at the level of the individual every day, that kind of pressure and tension.
Yeah. So these kinds of case studies, if you like, are kind of based on, or for a Marxist anyway, on in a sense of like how we prioritize volume one, volume two, volume three, and how they fit together, and how they kind of, I don't know, maybe kind of come full circle, and so on. And so I support your critique of the reduction of the capitalist mode of production to the first volume. And Marx himself was very critical of people using production. He said production in the narrow sense, which is just, not the mode of production, not the whole production of the whole system, but just the production part of that system.
Mhm.
And But when I read your account of the relationship between the three volumes and its relationship to the idea of the capitalist and the non-capitalist elements within them, I wonder whether there is, in some sense, a kind of a split in your thinking between volume one on the one side and two and three on the other, where volume one is concerned with capitalism and volume two and three offer these mediations through non-capitalist elements. And so is your definition of capitalist and non-capitalist elements actually based on this division, where volume one refers to the capitalist elements and volume two and three refer to the non-capitalist elements?
In a way, for sure, because I think the theoretical impulse of volume one is to develop a theory of capital labor relation and production, because it happens within the wage relation within production. But within Capital Volume 1, there's quite a lot of emphasis too on necessarily on living labor and the kind of like excess of human life, like the sort of materiality of human life and like muscles, bones, brains, you get these sorts of descriptions. And so that tension is already there, that you get this kind of like the complexity of the materiality of human life and in metabolism with nature is dominated by capital, but in a way that it can never like fully grasp it. So you get that already in volume one. But I would say yes, in the sense that I do think that volume one really looks at that production relation, and you really get a strong definition of what the capitalist relation is, in that it's a relation oriented to the abstraction of surplus value from labor and its circulation that that valorizes that to accumulate profit in the form of abstract labor. But then volume two focusing on circulation, and volume three focusing more on financialization, to be slightly reductive, but just to kind of shows you the full picture and the relationality of production within that. And so something that you find when you read all three volumes is that production is internal to reproduction. It's internal to circulation, which is a circulation between forms. And like, actually, it's kind of funny the order of it, because volume two is circulation, but it does kind of presuppose volume three, which the financialization exists within that circulation. In a way, I think it's a closer reading of production. And so rather than privileging reproduction as the other side of like a reductivist project of giving priority to production, I think it's closer to a commitment of production, because you're understanding how production is relational and how it's situated within circulation and reproduction, and the sort of the financialized forms that are necessarily, in Marx's account, necessarily and what we see empirically necessary is internally necessary for the preconditions of that capital relation that gets articulated in volume 1. And so the sort of like dialectics of the method is actually like you kind of need to get to the end to retroactively understand the beginning properly. And so it's not a kind of like split of like, this is a priority of reproduction, we're prioritizing social reproduction, it's a feminist position, blah, blah, but actually, yes, we want to bring all those things in and we want to think about the role of race and racialization. But actually, by doing so, we're understanding production better.
Yeah, yeah. If we look at recent writing that overlaps with yours, in some instances, people use the term the market as a kind of metonym for capitalism. This is especially the case in writing on art, I think. Or maybe that's just where I notice it most, because that's where I do most of my reading. It appears as both a specific moment in the cycle of capital, production, circulation, exchange, reproduction, and as the totality of capitalism. Would you say that you are trying to nudge Marxists towards a less market-centered analysis of capitalism?
Uh, yes, I think so. But that being said, you do need to orient yourself within the market because the market is where value is valorized. So, you can say there's a hidden abode of production and then there's the market, but also the market is within circulation where capital becomes valorized. But the book is kind of nudging Marxism towards an understanding of the contradictions in capital's total process. So it does nudge beyond the market to think about how capitalism interacts with presuppositions within the natural world. And that's beyond the market, but it's also internalized by the market. And so these things are, but if you look at it from the perspective of the market only, you're looking at the relationship to the natural world from a position where the natural world is already commodified. But I think that sort of like pulling it out and nudging it in that direction allows you to understand the being of the natural world, not to always use the word ontology, but really just referring to the being, which is a kind of like, to say it's not a metaphysics, we're not essentializing it, but it is this historical specificity of its being is irreducible to its commodification. And what does that mean practically? Is positions a kind of tension, and we see in the kind of destruction of the environment. Well, the destruction of the environment does undermine capital's reproduction because it runs out of resources and also destroys human life living within capitalism. That's a sort of necessary living labor for the reproduction of capital as well. And so it is a nudge beyond the market, but not to say like beyond the market without keeping our analysis of the market with us, but opening us up to those epistemological differences. And so it's not merely using the epistemology of the critique of the political economy, but thinking about the epistemology of the natural sciences and how that is a kind of disruption, interruption, or kind of pushes against capital.
So Marx uses words like metamorphosis a lot, doesn't he? So and like capital takes different forms and money takes different forms, and the forms that they take are always in relation to other things. So there's a kind of relation of mediation in this process of metamorphosis. And is it so? So the reason I'm saying this is because we started by decentering value production, looking at distribution and circulation, financialization, but then possibly not, therefore, flipping from production to either the market or to reproduction, but of seeing these things in relation to each other. And so I was wondering whether Marx's concept of like how these things metamorphose into each other, or how they are mediated by each other and they take different forms. Maybe that those are the things that is actually being kind of traced in
Mhm.
in this kind of 3 volume reading of capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is precisely why it's a reading from the perspective of reproduction, because reproduction is what facilitates that social whole and this mediation between these different spheres. You can only really get there from the perspective of reproduction, which is why like Marx's concept of social reproduction is a reproduction of the capitalist mode of production as a whole. And but I think you're pointing to metamorphosis is really important and interesting because it also points to the necessity of seeing these sort of epistemological or ontological differences, because capital as an abstraction moves between the concrete. Um, and so it will metamorph depending on what like concrete relation it's sort of abstractly representing. It that concrete sort of changes its relationship to its abstraction. So for example, the commodification of labor power or living labor is quite a different commodity than money is. And so it's not the value form um as value moves between what makes forms different is their concrete the concrete relation being different and then changing the form. And that act of metamorphosis is what enables us to also see. It's sort of, I think it's what provides the basis of these sort of like redoubled abstractions. And so when we look at like financialization, which happens in the sphere of circulation and reproduction, these are articulations of that movement of value that takes that is comes into being through abstract labor, sort of the objectification of labor, or dead labor, and adds another layer of abstraction to it. So it's another kind of metamorphosis, and sort of like this sort of constant shifting is not just something that we see in the sort of larger abstract these sort of like redoubled abstractions in financialization. It's something internal to what capitalism is always already doing, but it can't exist without the difference of the concrete. And I think a part of it is that like it was so important for Marx to articulate this critique of a political economy that got us to be able to see what capitalism was really doing underneath these sort of liberal appearances. But he couldn't have gotten to, and he did aim to get to articulate more like what was the concrete doing. And so I think like the project of Marxism at the moment is to expand that, because it's an element within Marxism that is under expanded. And that metamorphosis is like essential to thinking that. It's like what is it about the concrete that enables this sort of drastic change in the value form? There's a lot of theorization on the value form changing, but why does it change so much in relation to the concrete is quite under theorized, in part because it's something that Marx really didn't get to.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Can you say something about the relationship between a Marxist theory of law and your account of interpersonal power relations? Does your conception of extra economic or non-capitalist forms of domination within capitalism include, I don't know what it includes, but kinship relations, debtor creditor relations, leases, contracts, state benefits, etc., but also maybe law, political forms, and maybe even the state. Would all of those be included?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because my understanding of the relationship between the how the person functions within capitalism is that it's a form of abstraction that is legally supplied as a kind of metaphysics of capital. You need the legal form of the person for capitalism to produce its impersonal forms. And so the capital fetish is complemented by this legal fetish. And you get that in Paschakanus, this book on law and Marxism, which I would recommend anyone who's interested in this to read that, because it's a really detailed study on that. And my work on the person and interpersonal relations is sort of derived from that conception of that complementary form, as but it becomes as a kind of as a presupposition. It's also a medium of reproduction and an immanent externality, and it becomes complicated because you can't neatly say there are non-capitalist relations and capitalist relations without the fact that on each side there are multiple layers of abstraction taking place. So it's not neat, but the legal form of the person is another level of abstract domination that's functioning on the individual bearer within capitalism. And so, but that's necessary because in order to sell your labor power, you need to be a proprietor of your labor power. But then that opens up how we're understanding the relationship between other kinds of domination that operate as the necessary presuppositions of capitalist reproduction, especially thinking around racialization and how racialization is like used as a way of creating gross forms of hierarchy and inequality in order to either enable labor power to be free or lower or paid less. These happen as interpersonal forms of domination that enable capital to exploit more. And the legal form of the person it mediates that. And so the things around like gender-based discrimination is around one's inclusion or exclusion from the full legal form of the person is what and we're seeing that at the moment play out in terms of like trans inclusion or exclusion from the like, full legal form of the person. And those sorts of interpersonal forms of domination, I would say, are non-capitalist because capitalist abstractions are indifferent to that. They don't necessarily need that, but they do need these hierarchies. And so these sort of legal forms get worked out in a kind of conjunctural moment and are sort of bearing the weight of the history of the value form, but nonetheless exist outside it in the sense that you could have more or less egalitarian forms of capitalism where there's more gender inclusion and more gender exclusion, more racial inclusion, more racial equality, less racial equality, and we've seen that within the history of capitalism. And so that's why it's really important to have that differentiation, because you can't understand those things from the perspective of the value form. You need that mediation legal person to think about what's going on in terms of creating those presuppositions. And those presuppositions are not historically neutral. They'll be historically specific based on certain kinds of like politicizations and histories, and then may promote or undermine capital's reproduction. And all the time we see sorts of like elements that might undermine capital, like certain kinds of racism might undermine capital's accumulation of value. And so these things are also discordant. So yeah.
So we keep in the analysis of capitalism, we keep having to kind of push beyond capitalism to understand how it functions and how it reproduces itself. And so the in a sense, your argument within the 3 volumes is for an understanding of capitalism beyond the critique of political economy. And in a sense, that means that what the 3 volumes tell us is to go beyond the 3 volumes. And so does this analysis point us in the direction of Marx's political writings, which deal with, in a sense, what you could say were the non-capitalist activities and processes that need to be addressed in order to confront capitalism as a mode of production?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think too, like there's a bit of a complication there that like with the 3 volumes that has been sort of like edited in as a kind of complete set where actually like I think Marx wanted to write 6 volumes or something. But that being said, I think there's still a distinction between the critique of capital and Marx's political writings, and that I think the critique of capital, the critique of political economy enables you to orient the political intervention that Marx wants to make in his political writings. And so I do see them as quite like methodologically distinct, where the critique of political economy wants to tell you like what is capitalism. Um, and then once we better understand what is capitalism, we can use that to orient ourselves politically in a way that is like best, we're putting ourselves in a position where we're best able to undermine capital's reproduction. So that's my understanding of the relationship between the two. And so you do need that study in order to orient yourself in such a way where you're like able to intervene politically. And so they're quite different registers in how you're engaging.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for us to maybe open up to questions from YouTube. What do you think, Alex?
Yes, fantastic. Thank you both so much. Wait, I'm just gonna, there we go. Okay, so we actually only have about 10 minutes left. So what I'll do is we have a couple of questions, but maybe I'll read out all three of the questions that we currently have, Rebecca, and then you can take maybe whichever ones you want, mix them together, speak to, yeah, whatever you want to in the time we have remaining. So the first question is, can you talk about how your reading of Capital is distinct from and connected to Marxist feminism? So this person
Mhm.
acknowledged that social reproduction theory had come up multiple times, but was inviting you to clarify perhaps your relationship to that tradition.
Mhm.
Then we had a question about any possible connections between your argument and subsistence or mixed economies. Um, and then finally, we also had a question about Michael Lazarus's new book, Absolute Ethical Life. So this person says he argued for a reading of Capital, especially from a value form theory lens, as the Aristotelian ethical project, and was wondering what your thoughts are on that, if you have any.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll start with the first question around social reproduction theory, which I do have a distinct methodological approach. And the distinction is that I understand social reproduction, or use the term social reproduction to articulate the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, or the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production as a whole. Whereas the sort of new articulations of social reproduction theory, if you want to sort of package it as a kind of like distinct theoretical orientation, kind of derives itself from that book that Tithi Bhattacharya edited on social reproduction theory remapping class. And Sue Ferguson's work in relation to her. They've recently organized this really wonderful social reproduction theory lab that is developed around that question, kind of what is social reproduction theory? Because um, the purpose is to kind of orient it as a kind of distinct field of study that we could use in academia in a kind of interdisciplinary way. And that is to say that's symptomatic of the fact that it doesn't really exist like that right now. And there's quite a lot of internal differentiation within it. So I really don't want to answer this question in a way that sort of like homogenizes this body of work, because it's very internally different, and lots of like historical Marxist feminisms get kind of assimilated within it and also excluded from it for like maybe semantic reasons or political reasons. And so anyway, that is to say, it's not like I wouldn't understand it as a kind of clear theoretical terrain. However, that specific SRT sort of post-Lees-Vogel theoretical terrain wants to say that social reproduction refers to the reproduction of labor power, which means like the possibility of producing living labor. And so within Marxism, that also just means reproduction of human life. And I would like add that human life in metabolism with nature. But and so that's a kind of narrow version of what Marx refers to social reproduction as. And my orientation would be on the side of Marx, although I would understand that SRT version to be internal to that. And so the questions, complexities that are brought up and understood within that context are also very much within the band of what I'm trying to articulate and understand. I think it is a conversation, is in conversation with that terrain of theory. And so, yeah, that differentiation is probably that it boils down to that definition of what that term social reproduction. To the next question around subsistence and mixed economies, I think that I might refer you back to that conversation that Dave and I had around Banerjee about these sort of like quite differentiated practices that happen within, but also how that is opened up to like the fact that the way in which needs are met and practical needs are met in the reproduction of human life in metabolism with nature. It can take different forms that have anti-capitalist potentialities, and so I think it's a matter of like articulating these not as these sort of like separate sort of discrete practices. They need to be articulated in a kind of solidarity with other formations in order to work together politically to be anti-capitalist projects. And so I think you get this sort of articulation that I ended the presentation with, of that differentiation between anti-capitalist content and anti-capitalist form, because you're existing kind of within the broader framework of capitalist form, which we see in like his actually existing socialist societies. These are like socialist, communist societies that exist within the context of a global capitalism. And so there's a question mark as to whether that was really anti-capitalist form. And then could you read that question around ethics again for me, Alex? Sorry, I forget the
Yes, absolutely. So someone says, I recently read Michael Lazarus's Absolute Ethical Life.
yeah.
He argues for a reading of capital, especially from a value form theory lens, as the Aristotelian ethical project. I wonder what your thoughts on this are.
Okay. One thing I was thinking about, like in terms of ethics, I have trouble with articulating elements of thinking about like social form within capitalist society in terms of ethics, because I think ethics kind of acts as a fetishization, because I think that when we're dominated by capital's abstract forms, something like, for example, like care work exists within this sort of social formation of domination of capital's abstractions, and what you're doing is reproducing life that's oriented towards enabling the reproduction of capital. And so to sort of fetishize this as a kind of inherent good, or to see it as an inherent good, is a kind of fetish. And so I haven't read that book, so I can't really speak to it in particular, but whenever I see ethics in relation to Marxism, I'm a bit weary in terms of like how ethics often is fetishized and kind of becomes separated out from the materiality of the social form in which it exists.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that actually already brings us to the end of our time. But I would like to thank you so much, Rebecca, for presenting your book. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining us and for the fantastic discussion. And thank you to all the viewers at home who joined us. It's great that we'll get to have this resource on the website. Yeah, thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, done. We're not live.
On YouTube.